everyone. Welcome to Community CPA webinar. My name is Catherine, and I am with Community CPA. We are a full-service accounting firm, and one of the things that we do is we love to share information. Thursdays are kind of our special days because we have our guest speaker. So today we have Ashley Micciche here, who is going to be talking about retirement and rules of thumb that you should ignore, which many of you might not have heard of. So Ashley, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate your time and, of course, your expertise that you're sharing with us.
Thank you for having me, Catherine.
Of course, we always want to say no responsibility. Know that, information changes over time. We always try to give accurate information, but as things pertain specifically to your business, please consult your legal or financial advisors. And Ashley, thanks again for being here. So Ashley is the CEO of True North Advisors, and I will kick it off to you, Ashley. Thank you for I'll stop sharing so you can introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your experience in this field and the topic today on retirement rules of thumb that you should ignore.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, Catherine. It's great to be here and with your members as well. So just a little bit of background about myself. I started as a financial advisor back in 2007, right before the financial crisis. So I've lived through advising clients through that, as well as now a global pandemic and everything else in between. So it's been a really interesting time the last 14 or so years that I've been an advisor. And so about 3 years ago, I started a podcast called the 1 Minute Retirement Tip. And this topic of today, it kind of turns some things on its head. There's a lot of rules of thumb in personal finance, and there's good reason for that. Part of it is because a lot of us we're not taught a lot of these things in school about how to manage your money, how to, invest your money for retirement. And so a lot of adults enter the world with very little knowledge about just managing basic aspects of finance. So I think rules of thumb are very common, especially in personal finance. So you have things like, pay yourself first and, save 10% of your income for a comfortable retirement. And so there's lots of rules of thumb out there, and they're very useful because, rule of thumb is meant to have this broad application, be reliable for most people, but they're not reliable for everyone. And so I've come across many rules of thumb over the years, and so I picked several out that was the inspiration for a week theme around this retirement rules of thumb that you should ignore. So I talked about it on the podcast a few weeks ago, and I think it's a great way to kind of frame how you think about your own retirement. So should we just jump in, Catherine? Should I get started with rule of thumb number 1 that you should not pay attention to? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Oh, and by the way, behind me, in case you're wondering, I'm actually not a fan of doing these Zoom backgrounds. However, as I was telling Catherine before we started, I'm in the midst of a remodel right now. So my husband and I, our 3 kids, and our dog are all living with my in-laws. And so we're living in their attic. So the space behind me is a little bit messy. It's not appropriate I've got like clothes and laundry and stuff behind me. So, but this picture, I'm in Oregon, and the big news this week, other than the wildfires, has been this meteor shower that peaked this morning and is lasting through the next couple of weeks or so. So it's kind of exciting. There's a lot of people talking about it. So this is a picture of the meteor shower. All right. So the rule of first rule of thumb that you want to ignore or at least customize to your situation. Now, I have to give the caveat here. They should not just be abandoned completely, but it's important to understand where some of these rules of thumb can be both useful and then where they're flawed. So, the first one, this is the most common one. This is save 10% of your income for a comfortable retirement. It's very commonly dispensed advice that you need to save 10% of your income for retirement. However, there's a couple of flaws with this. One is that it assumes that you start saving really early. So it assumes that you're going to start saving in your 20s, you're going to retire in your 60s, you got 40 years of saving under your belt. But that's really just not realistic. Most people do not start saving in their 20s. They've got student loan debt. Then you hit your 30s, you've got kids, you're trying to buy a house. So a lot of people don't really get serious about saving for retirement until maybe their mid to late 30s, even into their 40s. So that can be problematic because sometimes you may need to actually end up saving more than 10% if you started a little bit later in life. But then on the other side of that, you might only have to save 5% over your working life or less if you intend to live a very frugal lifestyle in retirement. So it's kind of a good 10% is a good middle of the road to shoot for, but again, it's highly individualized based on your ability to save, how soon you started saving, when you want to retire, how frugal you want to live in retirement, or how extravagant you want to live in retirement. So the other thing is that if you are behind, so if you're watching this and you're like, man, I'm in my 50s, I started saving really late, hearing that you should save 10%, I think can be really discouraging for people. And so as, as you get earlier in your career, in your 20s, 30s, and even in your 40s, maximizing your savings is like the best advice that I could give you. However, if you are in your 50s and 60s and you're willing to work, even just like a year, a couple more years, a lot of times you'd be surprised how working just a little bit longer can really shore up a lack of savings earlier in your life. And then there are also benefits of working longer that are multifaceted. So if you work a little bit longer, that's maybe a year or two less that you're not taking Social Security, a year or two less that you're not relying on your investment portfolio to provide income. So there's a lot of benefits to working longer. There's psychological benefits as well. So I would just encourage anyone listening who's like, man, I haven't saved 10%. I'm a little bit behind, that working longer can a lot of times close that gap. So the next rule of thumb that I think is unreliable at best is there's a saying that says you take 100 minus your age currently, and that's the percentage of your overall investment portfolio that you should have in the stock market. And this has actually changed over the years. So it used to be 100. Now I see it more commonly as 120 minus your age. So if you are 50, you take 120 minus 50, that gives you 70. So that's the percentage of your portfolio that you should have in stocks. Now, it works great as a rule of thumb because it's a very easy shorthand calculation to kind of figure out what percentage you should have in stocks. But if you actually do the math at different stages, I think what ends up happening is that if you do 100 minus your age in later years, it's going to make you be a little bit too conservative. Like someone who's 50 shouldn't have 50% in stocks. That's too low. But if you use 120 minus your age, especially as you get closer to retirement, it might cause you to have a higher percentage in stocks than you really should for your age. And that is best for you from like a risk standpoint. So that's a very delicate balancing act, and it's also can be highly individualized. So you have to know thyself. And that's the best way to kind of circumvent the flaws of this rule, is that if you look at your stock portfolio every day and you get nervous at the slightest little whiff of bad news and you're tempted to sell, or like if you sold or even almost sold everything last year during the big drop during COVID, those are indications that you maybe have too much in stocks. So you have to be able, from a emotional standpoint as well, be able to kind of stomach those ups and downs. So it should be based on your age, your percentage in stocks. That's the number one determinant, but it also needs to take into account your tolerance for risk. And the fact that you can't be too conservative either, because inflation, there are other factors in retirement that can really eat away at your portfolio. So it is a dynamic and changing thing, and based on your age, but that's not the only thing. All right, so go ahead. Were you gonna say something, Catherine?
No, that's great. Go on.
All right, so the third rule of thumb is that if you can withdraw 4% of your portfolio and then increase that for inflation every year, that will ensure that you don't run out of money. So if you retire and you have $1 million in your portfolio, you can take out $40,000 in year one of retirement, and then you can increase that every year a little bit for whatever inflation is. And if you can stick to that spending rate in retirement, you're going to be relatively secure in the knowledge that you're not going to run out of money in retirement. So 4% as a withdrawal rate from your investments is backed by a lot of well-documented research that this is a safe withdrawal rate. It but it's flawed because it's a little bit oversimplified. So it doesn't take into account the impact of taxes or inflation, or the fact that your returns can vary widely from year to year. If you're unlucky to retire at the very beginning of a recession and a big down market that lasts for, like in 2008, 2009, that lasted for like 18 months, those can all be factors that can just like chuck this 4% rule right out of the window. So you want to do some additional planning around this, and that's where this rule of thumb can be useful. Leading up to retirement, it can help you see, okay, well, if I retired in the next couple of years, is 4% on my total asset balance, is that going to be enough? And so it can help you do some basic planning without a lot of time and effort. But once you're living in retirement, and even before then, so in the like 1 to 2 years prior to retirement, it's really, really important to sit down with your financial advisor to look at what's a safe withdrawal rate for me based on my other income factors, my other income sources, other factors like how I'm invested, when I'm retiring. You could sustainably withdraw more than 4%, or you may have to withdraw less than that. But it's important to sit down and run the numbers and do a customized analysis of that before you kind of make the leap into retirement and say, whoop, I hope it works out, and we'll see. Okay, so rule of thumb number 4 that you want to ignore is that there's this very common dispensed advice that you should spend no more than a third of your income on housing. So whether that's your mortgage or rent, it includes property taxes, it includes interest and principal payments, all of that. So this can be really problematic for people who are getting close to retirement and who are living in retirement. My opinion is, my belief is that when I look at clients who are retired who still carry mortgages, many of which do, paying a third of your income towards housing when you're retired is like walking around with handcuffs on. It really limits what you can do from a lifestyle standpoint. When you're retired, you want to be able to usually travel more, see your kids, see your grandkids, spend time on hobbies. If too much of your income is going to housing, it just leaves very little for everything else. So while the 1/3 rule can kind of keep younger people out of trouble by preventing them from paying like half of their income towards housing, I think more realistic for retirees would be to stick somewhere in the no more than 10 to 20% of your income on housing. Now, the nice thing is a lot of people will end up paying their mortgage, especially if you've lived in the same house for many years. You're likely to pay your mortgage off in the early years of retirement, hopefully. Or if you still have time left, many, many years, and you can work towards paying your mortgage down and making extra payments, so you could eliminate your mortgage altogether in the early years of retirement or even before you retire, that's ideal. A lot of people who enter retirement, they're going to downsize anyways. So you can downsize your house, downsize your mortgage, reduce your payment that way as well. So I really encourage, it's not talked about enough how important it is to really limit your debt obligations, and mortgage is one of the biggest ones, is especially in retirement. It's going to give you so much more freedom and flexibility to live a lifestyle that is just, not tied to staying at home because you can't afford to do anything else. All right, so on the flip side of that, it's important to reduce your debt as you get closer to retirement as much as possible. If you could have no debt, that would be ideal. However, there's one exception to this, and that is the rule number 5, which is always pay cash for cars. Now, if any of you know who Dave Ramsey is, he's a huge advocate of this. Like he'll just yell at people on his radio show and be like, "You're stupid if you're going to take a loan out or lease a car. It's stupid." And he's very adamant about this. So there's some interesting things that happen when you get older, though, that many people don't think about. So the first thing is Dave Ramsey's advice assumes that you're perfectly okay buying, a used car for a few $1,000s. However, I noticed that among my clients, whether they are, middle class or very wealthy or everywhere in between, reliability in a car becomes extremely important when you're in your 70s and your 80s. No 80-year-old wants to be stuck on the side of the road because their car broke down. So what ends up happening is retirees, even people who are very frugal with cars pre-retirement, they're willing to pay a lot more for a newer car. And so what ends up happening is that instead of looking at used cars that are maybe 10 to 15,000, you're looking at used cars that are 40,000. And you're weighing this, okay, well, do I pay cash for this car and withdraw a large chunk of my retirement portfolio to do that? And Catherine knows this too. Like, if you're going to take that money out of your IRA or your 401k account, guess what? You're going to pay taxes on that money too. So it becomes problematic to take a large sum of money out of your investment portfolio when you're retired just to pay cash for a car. And so I think it's really not black and white. I don't think it's a wise rule of thumb, especially if you're in retirement, to stick with the adage of always pay cash for cars. If withdrawing 40 or 50,000 is like a drop in the bucket and it's not going to hurt you in the long run, then there's nothing wrong with taking that out to pay cash for cars. But you look at the situation right now with interest rates so low, I mean, you can get a really good, reasonable rate and monthly payment on a car loan if you need to upgrade to buy a new car in retirement. So the last thing with that too, that I'll say that's you can kind of, there's the reliability factor, but the wise thing to do would just be to buy cars less often. So maybe when you are working, you replace a car every, 8 to 10 years. And as long as that car is reliable, maybe you can stretch that, to over 10 years at that point. So, and then that will prevent you from having to, make a large withdrawal or get a new car loan every few years. And then you'll have some gaps in there too, or since most car loans are 5 years, if you keep a car for, 8 to 10 years, you'll have stretches of time where you won't be having those monthly payments. So those are the rules of thumb. I'll just recap. So save 10% of your income for retirement, maybe not. Keep 120 or 100 minus your age in stocks. that I think of all of them is probably the most flawed. Withdraw 4% of your portfolio for income and retirement. Again, that's a nice rule of thumb, and it's generally reliable as a safe withdrawal rate, but it's not perfect, and it should be more individualized. And then definitely spending much less than 1/3 of your income on housing in retirement. And then always paying cash for cars is the last one that I think is pretty flawed. So those are the rules of thumb. I hope that was helpful, and I hope it helped you think about retirement and planning for retirement in new ways.
For sure. All right. Well, thank you for answering those questions as well. So thanks everyone again. 3 p.m. Central Time is when we have our webinars, so we will see you. Thanks once again, Ashley.
Thank you.